is I want to talk about the history of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of misconceptions, and a lot of misinformation about where our thing came from. And this is our thing. God does things in small bites, and what we have here didn't fall out of the sky. It wasn't hurled down in thunderbolts on stone tablets on Mount Sinai. This was not divinely inspired in one evening while Bill Wilson was laying in bed and his pencil flew across the page without any assistance from him. And what I'd like to do is to give to you the best I can, the information that I've been able to discover about how we arrived at what we have here. And I like to start the story back in the 16th century, in the reign of Henry VIII. For those of you that don't remember your 7th grade history or whenever it was taught, Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon. That was his first wife. They went on to have a total of 6. But Catherine of Aragon proved to be barren, or their union was barren, and they could not produce an heir to the throne of England. That bothered Henry quite a bit. So he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, who was one of Catherine of Aragon's maid of honor at their wedding, because he thought she looked like a very racy broad, I guess. So at that time, Europe was virtually 100%. Well, it was Catholic, or England was Catholic, and looked to Rome, the Pope in Rome for guidance, and Henry, who was on good terms with the Pope at that time, said, hey, I want an annulment from this marriage so I can marry Anne Boleyn and produce an heir to the throne of England. And the Pope said, absolutely not. I won't permit it. So Henry went ahead and married Anne Boleyn anyway without divorcing Catherine. And old Kate kind of got nervous when she was moved out of the palace. And the head of the church in England was Cardinal Wolsey, and he was also was the king's manager or minister of the affairs of state, and this made the cardinal mad that Henry would be so capricious and ignorant, and he promptly reported it to the Pope, and the Pope didn't know what to do. He couldn't hardly excommunicate the King of England, but he couldn't hardly permit this to go on either, since his specific order was defied. So they wrangled around for a long time, and Henry finally came up with a practical program of action to put in his solution into action, and he said, the hell with you. I've decided I don't like the Catholic Church anyway. He said, I'm going to be the head of the Catholic Church on the island of England, and that ain't all, Pope Clement. I'm going to confiscate all of your property. And he did. So the King of England became the head of the church in possession of all the property, and it gave Henry VIII quite a bit of power, and he went on to use that power because of the great increase in his wealth. But the upshot of it was that now we have a church that is basically identical to the Catholic religion in England, that's headed by the king. And it became known as the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, and in this country it's known as the Episcopal Church generally. On the East Coast, Virginia, places like that, from where there was some early settlements, I think it's probably still known as the Anglican Church. In about 1840, some 200 years after all this took place, The clergy in England and some of the intellectual elite in the country became very concerned about how the church was being run. They thought too much emphasis was being put upon secular affairs, affairs of this world, the accumulation of property, the controlling of people, and not enough emphasis was being put on spiritual matters. So this group of people, and it's not important how many they were, but or who they were, but they started an organization, a spiritual movement, that was known as the Oxford Groups. And the Oxford Groups were primarily concerned with the spiritual conduct of the church, and they operated outside of the church to get their spiritual fulfillment that the church wasn't giving them, and they were trying to influence the church to get spirituality back into it. And these Oxford groups spread throughout the English-speaking world and became quite powerful in their own right, and eventually passed from the scene in some time, and that's not important. That really doesn't have anything to do with Alcoholics Anonymous, except this. In 1921, a Lutheran minister in this country named Frank Buckman founded a spiritual movement based upon first century Christianity. And because in the English-speaking world the name Oxford Groups had some recognition and some substance, he named his movement the Oxford Groups. Now, the Oxford Groups in England were named that because they were started on the campuses of the Oxford universities, basically, and that's where that name came from. And Frank Buckman was trying to ride the coattails of this good press that the Oxford Groups had gotten. He started this movement, as I said, based upon first century Christianity principles, which is basically this, and we're going to talk about it a little more in depth. But those of you who are members of religious orders or not orders, or churches, that's the word. I told you I was confused. Know that much of the New Testament was written by the Apostle Paul long after many of the significant events in Jesus' life had already been reduced to writing. His writings in the New Testament probably amount to something in excess of 50% of the verbiage. And it tends to obscure the teachings of Christ because they, in some part, are contradictory. And the first century Christianity was, we will practice the principles as Jesus Christ set them down through his apostles, and all of this other stuff that Paul injected in here means nothing to us. He was very successful in this spiritual movement. And I want to read a little bit out of the book Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. This is a history book published by Alcoholics Anonymous. It's what's called conference-approved literature. It has the circle and the triangle on it. This book is primarily about Dr. Bob Smith, one of the co-founders. He's the guy on the right that looks so stern back here on the wall. This is about Dr. Bob, how the movement got started in Akron, Ohio, and in Cleveland, Ohio, and it's really good reading. I want to read a little bit about the Oxford Groups out of it. talking about Dr. Bob here coming into contact with the Oxford groups. It says, it was a spiritual movement that sought to recapture the power of first century Christianity in the modern world. Its founder, Frank Buckman, had brought followers into his first century Christian fellowship 2 decades earlier. His Oxford group movement, started in 1921, was based upon the same principles. Members of the Oxford group sought to achieve spiritual regeneration by making a surrender to God through rigorous self-examination, confessing their character defects to another human being, making restitution for harm done to others, and giving without thought of reward, or as they put it, no pay for soul surgery. They did, however, accept contributions. Emphasis was placed on prayer and on seeking guidance from God in all matters. The movement also relied on study of the Scriptures and developed some of its own literature as well. At the core of the program were the 4 absolutes, which you hear here in the program. Absolute honesty, absolute unselfishness, absolute purity, and absolute love. In addition to the 4 absolutes, the Oxford groupers had the 5 C's and the 5 procedures. The C's were confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, and continuance, while the procedures were give in to God, listen to God's direction, check guidance, restitution and sharing, for witness and for confession. There were slogans as well: study men, not books. Win your argument, lose your man. Give news, not views. In addition, a member recalled how groupers would go around smiling enthusiastically and asking each other, "Are you maximum?" And this maximum thing is, in order to get into the Oxford group, you weren't allowed to grow into it like we are here in Alcoholics Anonymous. You either believed or you didn't believe. If you believed what they believed, even before you knew it, you got in. If you didn't believe it, you didn't. When you said, "Hey, I believe everything that you're going to tell me," they'd let you in. And this surrender business, they evaluated each other on the degree of surrender, and the highest estate was maximum surrender, and they were running around asking each other, "Are you maximum?" And smiling real well. It's really none of your business. Get out the door then. But I would imagine that was pretty interesting in these meetings when they evaluated each other on their degree of surrender. I can imagine us doing that in Alcoholics Anonymous and still smiling. Undisputed leader as well as founder of the Oxford group movement, Frank Buckman was a Lutheran minister from Pennsylvania who did not drink or smoke. I don't trust that man. Buckman looked askance at AA in later years and was never quite comfortable with its members, and for obvious reasons. But Oxford groupers sought to change community leaders with the idea that their example would motivate others. Thus, there was a great deal of publicity and fanfare when new converts achieved spiritual rebirth. Dr. Buckman himself was often interviewed and widely quoted. And this is one of the reasons why the Oxford group that Buckman founded did not survive, because they were trying to influence affairs in the community at large, and they craved, or Buckman particularly craved publicity, and he'd speak at length on any subject. And he made some errors in judgment concerning what was going on in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and it killed the movement. And it passed from the scene early in the 1940s. That brings us up to our second character. Frank Buckman is really the first character in what we're doing here. The second character, his name is Roland Hazard. And if you turn to page 26 in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, we'll read about Roland Hazard. The first paragraph on page 26 a certain American businessman. That's Roland Hazard. He was born into a family of considerable wealth on the East Coast. They owned some type of factories. He was on the executive board of a large chemical company, and I suspect it was either Dow Chemical or what's the other big one in Wilmington, Larry? DuPont. Yeah, it was one of those two, and I've never taken the time to find out. But it says a certain American businessman had ability, good sense, and high character. For years he had floundered from one sanitarium to another. He had consulted the best-known American psychiatrists. Then he had gone to Europe, placing himself in the care of a celebrated physician, the psychiatrist Dr. Jung. And Dr. Jung was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud, which I'm sure probably most of you people have heard of Freud. Freud and Jung together are considered the fathers of modern psychiatry. Jung was a spiritualist who practiced psychiatry, and Freud was an atheist who practiced psychiatry. Jung isn't as well known today in the general public. Freud's philosophies kind of overwhelmed Jung's. People had tried church and failed to get relief, and so Freud's atheistic approach was appealing. And while their beliefs on the medical level weren't that different, their approach was different, and Freud's the well-known one today. Let's see, celebrated physician Dr. Jung, who prescribed for him. Though experience had made him skeptical, he finished his treatment with unusual confidence. His physical and mental condition were unusually good. Above all, he believed he had acquired such a profound knowledge of the inner workings of his mind and its hidden springs that relapse was unthinkable. Nevertheless, he was drunk in a short time. More baffling still, he could give himself no satisfactory explanation for his fault. So here we've got a man who's from a prominent family. He's very successful in his own right. He's apparently intelligent, has good character, high moral standards, and he's drunk, and here the great man in Europe can give him a lot of information, but he can't help him. So he returned to this doctor whom he admired and asked him with point blank why he could not recover. He wished above all things to regain control, and this is 1930 when he makes his second trip to see Dr. Jung. He seemed quite rational and well-balanced with respect to other problems, yet he had no control whatever over alcohol. Why was this? He begged the doctor to tell him the whole truth, and he got it. In the doctor's judgment, he was utterly hopeless. He could never regain his position in society, and he would have to place himself under lock and key or hire a bodyguard if he expected to live long. That was a great physician's opinion. He said, "There's no chance for you. I've seen a lot of people like you, and you die." He was no different than me, this Roland Hazard. But this man still lives and is a free man. He does not need a bodyguard, nor is he confined. He can go anywhere on this earth where other free men may go, without disaster, provided he remains willing to maintain a certain simple attitude. And we're going to talk about that certain simple attitude before we're through here. Some of our alcoholic readers may think they can do without spiritual help. Let us tell you the rest of the conversation I had with his doctor. The doctor said, "You have the mind of a chronic alcoholic." And chronic means there is no hope for recovery. It's forever. I have never seen one single case recover. where that state of mind existed to the extent that it does in you. So not only was Dr. Young telling him he was chronic, that he would never get well from what was ailing him, but it was the worst case he had ever seen. Our friend felt as though the gates of hell had closed on him with a clang. He said to the doctor, "Is there no exception?" "Yes," replied the doctor, "there is. Exceptions to cases such as yours have been occurring since early times. Here and there, once in a while, alcoholics who have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are phenomenon." When phenomenon meaning that it can't be explained in any scientific method. It just happens without any seeming cause. They appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. In fact, I have been trying to produce some such emotional rearrangement with you. With many individuals, the method which I employed are successful, but I have never been successful with an alcoholic of your description. So, what the great doctor had done was pronounce Roland Hazard dead. He couldn't predict when he was going to fall down, but he knew that he was a dead man, based upon his professional opinion, unless he could produce in himself this vital spiritual experience. And Dr. Young just didn't have any information on how to do it. He said, "Hell, go home, sit down, and see if it happens. Meanwhile, try not to drink." It's the best advice I can tell you. Now, to follow Roland Hazard, I've got to read to you again, and I know that's not quite as entertaining as following along. But this is in the book Pass It On, which is basically the story of Bill Wilson and how Alcoholics Anonymous got started in New York City. And I hope I can find this expeditiously here. Well, hell, that's not important. I'll just tell you what happened. Roland Hazard came back to the United States, and he was talking to some friends about what the doctor had told him. And they and some of their other friends were involved in the Oxford groups. They took Roland Hazard to the Oxford groups, and he had this vital spiritual experience, and he stayed sober. Okay, so as with most things that alcoholics do, we kind of do things sometimes in reverse order. If you're going to solve any dilemma, there's a standard formula that all human beings use. First, you have to know what is the problem, and you have to arrive at a sensible solution. And then you have to find a practical program of action to put that solution into motion. You know, for example, if my car runs out of gas on the highway, then I have to know that it's out of gas before I can do anything about it. It would be fruitless to start willy-nilly pulling off spark plugs, changing tires, and taking out headlights. You know, I've got to find out what the problem is. I may have to do that to find out what the problem is. But when I determine that I'm out of gas. Then I got to come up with a solution. The solution is I have to get gas. Doesn't mean a thing. If I sit there in my car, I still haven't solved the problem, even though I know what it is and I know what the solution is. I have to get out on the side of the highway and I have to start walking, or I have to hitchhike. And I've got to get some gas and put it in the car. When I get the gas in the car, it solves the problem. What Frank Buckman did was he provided us with a practical program of action. What Dr. Young did for Roland Hazard was that he provided him with the solution. Nobody knew what the problem was yet. So we're working this thing backwards. Now we've got another actor entering from stage right. And his name is Ebby Thatcher. And this takes place in 1934. And I hope I can find it this time. Oh, here it is. Ebby and Bill Wilson, Bill being the other founder who's on the left back there. Ebby and Bill Wilson went to school together. And they had been lifelong friends. And while they hadn't quite drifted apart, they weren't staying in contact with each other too much because they were both having so much trouble drinking. And sometimes good friends don't spend time with each other because they don't want their shit to slosh over on the other ones. I have a friend that I didn't see for almost 15 years. He drank worse than I did. And he says that I drank worse than he did, and we kind of agreed without ever stating that we'll never see each other again, because every time we do, the problems just explode. So, and that was kind of the way Bill and Ebby were. They just kind of agreed without saying it. You know, you go drink and I'll get in my corner and I'll drink, and we'll still be good friends though. Even though we're probably never going to see each other again before we die, and they'd cry and drink some more. Yeah. Well, hell. Oh, here it is. Ebby was in Vermont. His family had kind of shunted him off to a little summer home they had up here in Vermont, and they were trying to give him a little busy work to keep him out of trouble. They thought, you know, son of a bitch can't hold a job, and we got to support him anyway. We may as well get some work out of him. So they sent him up to Vermont, where some friends could keep an eye on him, and he could do a little handyman work, and hopefully not get in as much trouble in a small town in Vermont as he could get into in New York City. Well, he had some friends up there who, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on which side of the fence you're on, who were in the Oxford groups. And Ebby couldn't stay sober. He just kept screwing everything up. So these two friends had been to New York City and had met Roland Hazard. And his friends weren't alcoholics, but they knew Roland was. And they asked Roland to come up there and talk to Ebby, see if he could make any sense out of him. It says Roland said to Ebby that he had a thorough indoctrination in the Oxford group teachings. He passed as much of this on to me as he could. We would sit down and try to rid ourselves of any thoughts of the material world and see if we couldn't find out the best plan for our lives for that day and follow whatever guidance came to us. Roland Hazard impressed upon Abby Thatcher the four principles of the Oxford group: absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, absolute love. He was particularly strong in advocating absolute honesty, Abby said. Honesty with yourself, honesty with your fellow man, honesty with God. And these things he followed himself, and thereby, by the example, he made me believe in them again as I had as a young man. Ebby was able to complete the house painting job with the help of a local contractor, probably paid by Ebby's brother. Ebby had gotten a job painting the house, and he'd gotten too drunk to finish. He couldn't get up on the ladder, and that's when Roland comes to see him. When it was finished, Ebby had nothing to do. I went right back to the bottle, he said. One day it was raining hard, and I happened to look out and saw 4 or 5 pigeons that had lighted on the roof. I didn't like that. A new paint job, so I got the old double-barrel shotgun and walked out. It was very slippery on the grass. It had been raining hard. I sat down, and from that position, I started blazing away at the pigeons. The neighbors didn't like it. No shit. And they complained to somebody. I wonder who. So the next day they were down looking for me, but I was sound asleep and they couldn't get in. Arrested the following day, Abby was taken to court in Bennington and ordered to appear again the following Monday. It was at this point that Roland H. interceded and told the judge that he, Roland, would be responsible for Abby. He said, "Judge, I promise, just don't put him in jail. I'll get him out of town." So what he did, with Roland's help, Abby closed up the family house in Manchester. For a while he was a guest at Roland's home in Shaftesbury, 15 miles south of Manchester, and then came to New York City, where he stayed with Shep for a while, and then went to live with one of the Brotherhood who ran Calvary Episcopal Mission on 23rd Street in New York City. Roland Hazard had been very active in this mission on 23rd Street in Manhattan, where the drunks came in. It's like the Salvation Army Harbor House downtown on Washington. And this is where he took Abby Thatcher. It was while he was staying there at the mission and working with the Oxford group that he heard of Bill's desperate situation. So now we've got Bill Wilson coming onto the stage. He's the next to the last guy in this whole drama, and he's the one that's most familiar to us all. Turn to your, page 7 in your big book, and we'll read about what happened. The second complete sentence, or paragraph, it relieved me somewhat on page 7. To learn that in alcoholics the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor, though it often remains strong in other respects. My incredible behavior in the face of a desperate desire to stop was explained. Understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. For 3 or 4 months the goose hung high. I went to town regularly and even made a little money. Surely this was the answer: self-knowledge. And I'm going to tell you what that self-knowledge was in a minute. We're not quite there yet. But Bill's feeling pretty cocky. He had just gotten out of the hospital again. He'd made 3 or 4 trips to Towns Hospital in New York City and was treated by Dr. William Silkworth, who was one of the pioneers in the field of treatment of alcoholic drug addiction. And Dr. Silkworth had given him some information, and he thought, goddamn, now that I know, I'm okay. But it was not, for the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. After a time, I returned to the hospital. This was the finish, the curtain, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop a wet brain, perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker or the asylum, and Bill didn't care one way or the other. Either one was okay with him. Just give me something to drink. They did not need to tell me. I knew and almost welcomed the idea. It was a devastating blow to my pride. I, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities and of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. There wasn't any way out for him. He knew it, and he didn't care. Now I was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless procession of sots who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What I would not give to make amends, but that was over now. No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. Right there, Bill Wilson took step one. He admitted he was powerless over alcohol. He didn't know what he was doing or what the result of it was going to be, but he had done it. Once again, he's getting out of the hospital. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink, and on Armistice Day, 1934, I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I like that word. I'm not even sure I know what it means, but it sounds bad. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Now, he didn't know all this was coming. He just knows, looking back, that it was when he took that first step and what happened next, that's what happened to him. Near the end of that bleak November, and this November 1934, I sat drinking in my kitchen. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. Praise God. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of our bed. I would need it before daylight. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. This is Ebby Thatcher. He was sober. It was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Rumor had it that he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. I wondered how he had escaped. Of course, he would have dinner, and then I could drink openly with him. Unmindful of his welfare, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time we had chartered an airplane to complete a jag. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility. The very thing, an oasis. Drinkers are like that. The door opened and he stood there, fresh-skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. Disappointed but curious, I wondered what had got into the fellow. He wasn't himself. "Come, what's this all about?" I queried. He looked straight at me, simply but smilingly. He says, "I've got religion." Bill was floored. I was aghast. So that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little cracked about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire all right, but bless his heart, let him ramp. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching. And Ebby had only been sober 2 or 3 months at this time, but Bill could tell a big difference in him. You could see it in his appearance and the color of his skin, how he carried himself, in his eyes. He could see the difference. But he did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he was told how 2 men had appeared in court persuading the judges to suspend his commitment. And that was Roland Hazard telling the judge, if you just let me have him, I'll get him out of your jurisdiction, you'll never see him again. They had told of a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. That was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. He had come to pass his experience along to me if I cared to have it. I was shocked but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. He talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on still Sundays way over there on the hillside. There was that proffered temperance pledge I never signed. My grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folks and their doings, his insistence that the spheres really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen, his fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. These recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard.
Ted.
Am I ready now?
You're ready.
Okay. Okay, so Frank Buckman and the Oxford groups had come up with a practical program of action. Dr. Young gave Roland Hazard the solution. Now I want to go back to the doctor's opinion, XXVI, page Roman numeral 26. When Bill was in the hospital, Dr. Silkworth had told him what the problem was. It says, the first paragraph, we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy. That the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all, and once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, once having lost their self-confidence, their reliance upon things human, their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. Frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. The message which can interest and hold these alcoholic people must have depth and weight. In nearly all cases, their ideals must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their lives. Now, Dr. Silkworth wrote this after Bill and Bob had started the fellowship and developed the program. All he knew when he talked to Bill was that alcoholics have an allergic reaction to alcohol. That's part of the problem. So Bill is finally about to get all 3 pieces of the puzzle. And he's the only guy, or he's the first person that has ever gotten all 3 pieces. And I've forgotten where I left off.
10.
Page 10. Where?
Second paragraph.
Okay. Okay, so Ebby's talking about Bill, or Ebby's talking to Bill about the solution and the practical program of action for the problem that only Bill knows. So I had always believed in a power greater than myself. I had often pondered these things. I was not an atheist. Few people really are, for that means blind faith in a strange proposition that this universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. My intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists, suggested vast laws and forces at work. Despite contrary indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay all. How could there be so much of precise and immutable law and no intelligence? I simply had to believe in the spirit of the universe, who knew neither time nor limitation, but that was as far as I had gone. With ministers and the world's religions, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me, who was love, superhuman strength, and direction, I became irritated, and my mind snapped shut against such a theory. Okay, so he's trying to convince Ebby that he thinks all of this is real nice, but it just doesn't apply to him. You know, he's tried all this shit. His family didn't like it. He doesn't like it, etc., etc., etc. I'm not an atheist, but I don't want to be bothered with any of that because I don't believe any of that. And over on page 12, down in the second paragraph, Ebby says, I'm tired of listening to you, Bill. I don't want to talk about the nature of God. I don't want to talk about where he lives or what kind of car he drives or how much money he makes a year. I don't want, none of that is my business or any of your business. If you want to think about it, fine. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? Step 2. That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. So what Ebby did was he gave Bill permission to break the shackles of all of this information that had been forced on him about religion and the nature of God and all of this, and said, find something that you can believe in. Step 2. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Being willing to believe. Nothing more was required for me to make my beginning. So at this point, Bill's taken step 1. He's admitted that he was powerless. And he says, I'm willing to believe that there's a loving God. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. Thus I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. At long last, I saw, I felt, I believed. Scales of pride and justice fell from my eye. A new world came into view. The real significance of my experience in the cathedral burst on me. For a brief moment, I had needed and wanted God. There had been a humble willingness to have him with me, and he came. But soon the sense of his presence had been blotted out by worldly clamors, most of those within myself, and so it had been ever since. How blind I had been. And Bill's talking about a religious experience that he had had in Winchester Cathedral in England during the First World War, where he felt the presence of God, and it was a fleeting thing, and it left him, and he never got it back. Now he thinks he's about to get it back. At the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time, so he talks to Ebby, and he goes back to Towns Hospital to get dried out one more time. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. There I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. I ruthlessly faced my sins and became willing to have my newfound friend take them away, root and branch. I have not had a drink since. He took step 3 right there. Placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. My schoolmate visited me, and I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies. We made a list of people I had hurt or toward whom I felt resentment. That's step 4. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals, admitting my wrongs. Step 6. Never was I to be critical of them. I was to write all such matters to the utmost of my ability. Step 6, 7, and 8 right there. I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. Common sense would thus become uncommon sense. I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. Step 11. Never was I to pray for myself except as my request bore on my usefulness to others. Then only might I expect to receive, but that would be in great measure. So Bill, with Ebby's help, worked what would become the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and Bill was in possession of the knowledge of the problem. He knew what the solution was, and he had a practical program of action. Bill is now sober for the rest of his life. He never took another drink from the day he checked into the town's hospital in November of 1934. And I'm really taking a long time to do this. I got about another 2 hours to go here, but I'm going to try and wind it up. I told you I was a little windy.
Okay, don't do that.
But I like to talk about these things because they're important to me. And if they're important to me, they might be important to somebody else. And the more I get to say them, the clearer it becomes to me, too. I think instead of reading about some of these things, I'm just going to give you some brief thumbnails on what has happened next. Bill gets involved in the Oxford groups, and he starts working down on Wall Street again. As you know, he was a stockbroker, very discredited. People had no confidence in him anymore. Very bad track record, staying sober and being able to do a job from start to finish. He got a job trying to manage a proxy fight over the control of a company out in Akron, Ohio, where all the rubber industry is centered. And he went out there on an extended stay, left his wife Lois in New York City. And Bill became very lonely. He worked hard. He wasn't very successful. He became disillusioned. He felt like he wanted to drink. He was disconnected with the Oxford Group Fellowship. So he called several ministers in town and explained his problem, and he got in touch with a minister that knew some people in the Oxford groups, and he put him in touch with a lady by the name of Henrietta Seiberling, and those names aren't important, but that's who it was. Henrietta Seiberling was a personal friend of the Dr. Bob Smith and family. Dr. Bob was a horrible drunk. Dr. Bob was a proctologist who at one time had a very successful practice. He had drank it up. He was in danger of losing his house. His bills were unpaid. He was considered disreputable. Nobody came to see him anymore. Nobody, either socially or professionally. How would you like to have a drunk proctologist working on you? So Henrietta called Dr. Smith's wife and said, "There's somebody in town from the Oxford groups," and well, let me back up. I left out a piece here. Dr. Bob had been going to the Oxford groups for about 2 years. And he didn't know what the problem was that he was trying to solve, and he was trying to use a solution and a practical program of action. So he was still drinking, but he had tried the Oxford groups. So Bill or Henrietta called Dr. Smith, Dr. Bob's wife, and said, this guy wants in from New York, and he's in the Oxford groups, and he wants to talk to Dr. Bob. Or he wants to talk to a drunk, and I don't know a drunk more worthy than Dr. Bob. So she said, well, Bob's too drunk to talk. Give me a couple of days and see if I can get him sobered up. So they worked on Bob, and they got him pretty well straightened out. He was only in an acute hangover, and he consented to talk to Bill Wilson. But on neutral ground, he wasn't going to let this yahoo into his own house. So they went over to Henrietta Seiberlin's house to meet. And Dr. Bob got there and he told Henrietta, he said, I'll give this guy 15 minutes. That's it. I've tried all this shit, and I love you all, but I'm not gonna put up with this. I'm just doing it to humor you. I need to get home and get a drink. So Bill shows up, and he and Bob go into the library or whatever it was, had this 15-minute talk, and Bob told Bill, he says, you've got 15 minutes, that's it. He said, I'm going home. They talked for 2 hours. Recently, excuse me. I think I'm all right now. The reason they talked for 2 hours was this. Bill didn't preach to him. Bill talked about himself. He talked about how he drank. He didn't ask Bob how he drank. He didn't ask Bob questions that had no answers, like, why do you treat people like this? Don't you have any self-respect? Look what you're doing to yourself and other people. Your father and mother would be turning over in their grave. Bill talked about himself. And Bill talked about the problem. And here, Dr. Bob, a medical man, was being told by another alcoholic what the medical problem was. Once Dr. Bob understood what the problem was, then he and Bill started sharing experiences about trying to use the solution and the practical program of action that they had both been studying in the Oxford groups. And that was the beginning of a lifelong friendship. Dr. Bob wasn't through drinking. It kept Dr. Bob sober for about 2 weeks. And he went to a medical convention, got drunk, came back home, sobered up again on the 10th of June, 1935. And that's considered the anniversary of the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. The date of Dr. Bob's permanent sobriety. Dr. Bill stayed in Akron for a number of weeks with Dr. Bob, and they talked a lot, and they said, now we know what the problem is and what to do about it. What are we going to do? And they said, we've got to give it to other people. So that's what the Oxford group said for them to do, and that's what they felt they needed to do. They couldn't live together for the rest of their lives, keeping each other sober. So Dr. Bob, he calls up the hospital where I think he had been disbarred from the hospital, that he calls, and he talked to one of the head nurses, and he says, I found a way to keep alcoholics sober. He said, do you have any prospects down there that I could work on? The nurse said, well, why don't you try it on yourself? He said, well, thank you very much. I've already done that. So they go to a hospital there in Akron, and they see Alcoholics Anonymous number 3, and Dr. Bob's Nightmare is the first story in the story section, which more fully discusses what I've been talking about concerning Dr. Bob. And Alcoholics number 3 is the second story in the back of the book, and that man's name was Bill Dawson. And they went to and he had come into the hospital for the umpty-umpth time, violent, in delirium tremens. He was in restraints in the hospital bed. He had beaten up several nurses or attendants. Bob and Bill go and talk to him. They tell him what his problem is. They tell him what the solution is. And they say, if you would like to work this practical program of action, everything is going to be okay. Bill never drank again. Bill Dawson never drank again. That, in a nutshell, is how we arrived at where we are today, or how we began to arrive at where we are today. And I was going to cut this off at 9 o'clock, and there's not a lot of things that anybody can share about, so I'm just going to go ahead and talk. There's a couple of other things that I want to touch on, and then I am going to shut up. What became known as Alcoholics Anonymous were in the early days were in the Oxford groups. Alcoholics Anonymous started in Akron, Ohio. When Bill finally left Akron and went back to New York City, he went to the Oxford groups, and he started doing what he and Dr. Bob were doing within the Oxford groups. And as we read earlier, Frank Buckman didn't like what the alcoholics were doing in the Oxford groups. Some people in Akron knew some alcoholics up in Cleveland, and Cleveland got some people from Cleveland were coming down to Akron, and they were doing these same things. And finally, there were so many of them, they started their own thing up in the Oxford groups in Cleveland. And up until 1939, well, that's not quite true. I think New York City left the Oxford groups in about 1937. The New York group was kind of atheistic. Akron was very fundamentalist, and they stayed in until about 30. They stayed in the Oxford groups until 39. I think Cleveland left the Oxford groups in 38. But that's not important. Anyway, what became known as Alcoholics Anonymous continued to operate within the established Oxford groups. And the reason I want to talk about this was because in 1934, a book was written called Sermon on the Mount. And it was written by a British metaphysical theologian whose name is Emmett Fox. And metaphysical theology, quite basically, is this. It means that matters of faith can be proved using scientific methodology if you will but open your eyes to the evidence. Okay. But when you are doing a chemistry thing, I'm having trouble getting the right words here. When you're performing a chemistry experiment, you can see the tangible results of what happens. If you take two atoms of hydrogen and put it with one molecule of oxygen in some form, you get water. You know. But when you are talking about matters of faith, you have to open your mind to a different kind of evidence. And Emmett Fox, in Sermon on the Mount that he wrote in 1934, and he wrote many other books too on similar subjects, he was talking about how you look for this evidence in your life that will scientifically prove that faith doesn't have to be a matter of blind or just accepting things blindly. And what's significant about this is that this book was being studied in the Oxford groups while Bill and Bob and the pioneer members in Alcoholics Anonymous were going there. And many of the ideas that are in the book of Alcoholics Anonymous come directly from that book. It is really the mother of the book Alcoholics Anonymous.
What was the name of it?
Pardon me?
What was the name of the book?
Sermon on the Mount. And it's all of Emmett Fox's books, and he's been dead for 50 years or better, are still in print. They're excellent. The bigger bookstores have them on the shelves. Any bookstore can order them for you. Most of the recovery literature stores generally have copies. At some point in time in everybody's recovery, and it's different for everybody else, it's good reading. It's probably not good reading before you gain some understanding of what we're trying to do in here. You know. But it clears up a lot. It cleared up a lot of matters in my spiritual thinking when I finally got to the point where I felt like I could read it. You know, and when you pick it up, you know whether you can read it or not. I mean, if you can't read it, you can't read it. If you can read it, you will read it. You know, it's one of those kinds of things. So don't think I'm saying go out and get a copy and read it, because it ain't necessarily so. I would also like to say that the book of James was studied a lot in early Alcoholics Anonymous, and there was a tremendous amount of sentiment to name what became Alcoholics Anonymous, the James Society. And I don't know much about it. I can't say that I've ever read the book of James. I've read some things in the Bible, and I'm sure I probably read in it, but I'm not, you know, I don't read the Bible frequently. I've really never investigated what's in there. But certainly some ideas came from there. This book, Alcoholics Anonymous, just to give you a little brief synopsis on it. When they're in about 37 or 38, when there were 50, 60, 70, 80 members, they wanted to carry this message to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And they thought about doing this in a variety of ways. They thought about writing newspaper articles. They thought about publishing a magazine. They thought about making motion pictures. They thought about buying radio advertising. And they also thought about writing a book. And One of the reasons why they settled on a book was that it looked like not only was it going to accomplish their purpose, but it would also produce the most cash. They wanted some cash. Because Bill was pretty well devoting full time to trying to get this thing off the ground so that it just didn't wither and die. Because they all the early members knew that they had found something that would work. So they concluded to write a book. And the book was written by committee. And there were 100 members in 1939 when it was published, 100 sober members. And Bill was kind of coordinating everything, and Bill would write a chapter and send it out, distributed throughout the fellowship, which consisted of New York City, Cleveland, and Akron. And they would send back comments, and he would look at the comments and tear his hair out and try and incorporate them. And everybody wanted to do something different. And Bill finally got mad one day and said, you know, and he kind of wrote it the way he wanted it, but it wasn't too offensive to everybody. So, but it was written primarily by committee. The book does not have a name. Alcoholics Anonymous, that is on the cover, is the authorship. It was written by alcoholics who were anonymous. And that is where the name of the fellowship came from. And the reason the book was written, it was a 12-step tool. They were trying to get some publicity. And remember, this was before the traditions were written. You know, this book never produced any cash, and certainly not in any volume. Initially, anyway, not up to their expectations. But this book was written so that an alcoholic anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world, if he got in contact with somebody in the fellowship or through Bill in New York City, that they would send him this book and tell him to read it. Because there, you know, if somebody went in Chicago or Los Angeles or Little Rock or Shreveport wanted help, these people were alcoholics, and many of them, the early members, were Skid Row type, low-bottom drunks, and they were broke. They didn't have any money. Nobody could jump on a train or an airplane or could drive their car to talk to these people. So they sent them this book, and the man was supposed to read the book, follow the instructions, and go out and start his own fellowship. And that's why some of the things in there read a little funny today. They don't make sense in light of today's circumstances necessarily, because it was one man reading this book and starting his own fellowship. That's the instruction book. Conditions have changed a little bit, but the information is still the same. You know. So that when I found that out, this book didn't look quite as dated or as absurd, you know, and it made a little more sense to me that I didn't have to go out and start my own fellowship. You know. There's a couple of things I'd like to, a couple other things, but I think I'm going to hold them for another session, and I'm going to wind it up for tonight. I don't know if you want, some people want to share a little bit, we can, or if you want to go home, that's okay too. You know, it's going to be kind of fun. I like doing this. It's a hell of a commitment, but I like to pass it on, and every time I say these things, they become a little more real to me, and I'm looking forward to it. And thanks for listening tonight.